So good evening, good morning, depending in which time zone are you all in this moment. I think we tried really to make the best out of the situation that we have at the moment. This conversation is supposed, of course, to happen in the real actual space of Central for Cultural Decontamination, but given this situation, we are doing it online. But because of that, we have a much wider attendance. And I would like to thank, first of all, to the panelists, but also to all the people who accepted to attend and who will, of course, after that, join the discussion. This is the first and very experimental case study in our program, which should contain 7 or 8 of similar case studies in which we try to speak about a very complex issue, about the issue of cultural exchange and cultural influence, but somehow beyond or beneath the usual historiographical way in which some major, most important events are already researched and discussed within the history when we are talking about primarily about the Yugoslav American and later Serbian American cultural exchange. So what we want to do with this particular project is to speak about, I mean, the word was mentioned yesterday by Pavle Levi, cross-fertilization, this kind of idea that, there's exchanges and this kind of contacts usually, which we find most important in the field of art, happened somehow beneath the actual ceremonial cultural exchange. And we think that some of these meetings points, some of these contacts were crucial for a development of certain artistic language. In this case, in the case of the particular case study that we are going to talk tonight, it is the alternative film, underground film, or experimental film, depending, of course, how we want to define this. And we have, I think, for the start, really a fantastic situation in which our two guests, our two panelists tonight, are really themselves examples of this cross-fertilization, because we have Greg de Kuir, who is originally from LA, but now is based in Belgrade, and Pavle Levi, who is originally from Yugoslavia, and now is based in San Francisco. So we are having on our panel a kind of living example of something that we are going to talk to tonight. So I will not say anything longer at this particular moment. I'll just give, first of all, the introduction, or just a short introduction to who our panelists are. Most of you, of course, know our panelists very well. And then I will do some kind of soft moderation of the discussion. And after the main conversation between Greg de Kuir and Pavle Levi, we will invite all the participants who want to pose some questions or give some comments about the talk to join in our discussion. So briefly, Greg de Kuir is a very, very, very important person in Belgrade. I think that at the moment, as far as I understand, the second edition of his book on the Yugoslav Black Wave cinema is going to be out soon. He's also running this Alternative Video Festival in Belgrade, but he's also internationally very much present on the film scene, writing for different magazines, participating in different festivals as a curator of different programs. Of course, his biography and CV you can also find online. And Pavle Levi, who is a professor in Stanford University, the director of the Center for Russian and Central Eastern European Studies, as far as I know its name, and the author of some of the really very prominent and I would say extremely important books that are like Disintegration of Frames, Cinema by Other Means, Jolted Images, which are available both in English and in Serbo-Croatian or how we call it, our language. It's also, I must mention today that today we just received a new publication by Pavle Levi, published by Mama Zagreb, which is called Nefiltrirane kino misli u doba pandemije. So this is the very fresh take on the three American science fiction films from the 70s in relation to the global pandemic at the moment. So I'm really very pleased to have both of you here. Greg is in Belgrade, Pavle is in San Francisco. So the idea is to have, first of all, Greg, who will present this particular case study that we are going to talk about tonight. It's related to Paul Adams' Sydney, and one of these kind of crucial events that belong to this kind of almost mythological territory of these forms of cultural exchange and cross-fertilization, to pick this particular case study and to talk about it. And then we will invite Pavle to join as a respondent, to join in and to basically, first of all, respond to Greg's presentation, and then we will raise a discussion, raise a dialogue. I suppose the idea is that the first part of the discussion should not be more than 1 hour long, like 50 to 60 minutes long, and then after that we will invite attendees of the discussion to join in with their comments and questions. So I would like to first welcome and invite Greg DePuer to take the floor. It's for my first moderation Zoom, so forgive me about any mistakes that I will make during this. So Greg, the video is yours.
Okay, thank you, Branko. Hvala. Dobrodošli, dobroveče. Good evening, actually, good afternoon, good morning. I don't know where all of you are. And also, hopefully you can all hear me fine. Hopefully you can see me fine. I'm sort of an amateur, proud to be an amateur, a kino amateur at the Zoom thing, at the video conference thing. So it's a strange feeling for me, particularly because I know there's so many of you that have signed up for the session and that are listening now. It was funny to me, actually, when I saw the list of participants, and it's a strong list, and hopefully I won't be repeating too much information that a lot of you already know. But I'm happy so many colleagues and collaborators and people that were also there and knew some of these events and some of these figures that we're going to talk about that knew them firsthand. So it's always a strange feeling for me to be giving talks on subjects that a lot of people in the audience probably lived more intimately than I've come close to. Nevertheless, I'll try. What I'm going to do today is sort of give a work in progress, let's say. This is more a beginning than an end, actually. I think for the entire research project, certainly for me and my engagement within it. So what I want to do is sort of present a project in motion, sort of research in the process of being made. So I have a lot of raw data and a lot of anecdotal evidence for you. And then by the time I'm done saying what I have to say and sort of introducing you to some of these important peoples and dates and events and places, our dear friend and colleague Pavle will hopefully tie things together and sort of bridge us into the next part of the discussion in terms of what this all means and sort of how to put all these pieces of the puzzle together. It's a large puzzle, sort of a complex puzzle, but yeah, we'll start working through it now. So I want to start out with, I'll come back to the title of this talk, the title of this sort of element of the research project eventually. But it's based on a really important figure, not just for his intersection with Yugoslav avant-gardists and the film avant-garde of the golden age, I guess we can say, but also in general, in terms of film studies and we could even say film history, the history of film studies for sure. This is P. Adam Sidney. And the first thing that I would actually like to do is to hopefully give him a proper introduction to sort of lead into how he fits into this Yugoslav story. And how sort of the title of this presentation and his activities came to be. So that's our first stop on this journey. We're going to talk a little bit about P. Adam Sidney, who I'm sure a lot of you already know and have already read and have already studied and possibly have already met. But for those that haven't, let's start from the beginning. He was actually born in 1944. And when he was 19 years old, in the course of his studies, his university studies, he took some time off and decided to travel and to lecture and to show films in Europe. Now, that was in 1963. Again, he was 19 years old. I don't know what you were doing when you were 19. I don't even want to say what I was doing when I was 19. This trip that he took became what was called, or what they called, the first international exposition of new American cinema. And this international exposition was something that he co-selected. He co-selected it and organized it with Jonas Mekas, which is a name, of course, that you all know, I'm very sure. So before we get into that, let's go back a little bit more for some biographical details that I think are really interesting about Sidney. So before we even get to 19 years old, still a teenager, he was publishing and editing way before that. And I think it's kind of fascinating to consider him not one of these, but a child prodigy, really, in terms of cinema studies, certainly in the United States. And maybe he was one of the earliest. But we're going to meet a few more child prodigies in the course of this presentation and this talk. But let him be the first. When he was 16 years old, he had already started organizing a film society in his hometown. He was very interested in cinema. He grew up in New Haven, which is in Connecticut, a place I've never been. He loved film, but didn't really have very many options. So, like probably a lot of people would, he took matters into his own hand and put together a film society. And not only did he put together a film society, he also put together the journal for this film society. It was called FilmWise. And that's something that he edited and obviously also wrote for. One of the interesting things at this early moment when he started working on this film society, meeting a lot of people, renting films, showing films from all over. At age 16 still, he had met Stan Brakhage in New York City. And he organized a screening of his films at this particular film society. And not only did he do that, this was I'm leading into sort of his first important connection with these new American cinema figures. But not only did he organize a showing of his films, he actually also published a special issue of the journal dedicated to his writing. So he saw his writing, saw his work, and really recognized this as something that he wanted to get involved with, something that he wanted to sort of help spread out and sort of share with the rest of the world. So yeah, at age 16, the child prodigy publishes a special issue of the writings of Stan Brakhage. One other interesting fact about these sort of precocious teenage years for Sidney, as part of this journal, he collaborated with a lot of different artists, different writers, different poets, people that he felt could sort of add something, obviously, to the film society, but particularly to the journal. And he got a moment of inspiration when he was putting together one of the issues of the journal and got the idea, like many of us would, maybe I should reach out to Jean Cocteau and see if he'll design a cover for me. And he did. So the 16-year-old was in touch with Cocteau, of course. And of course, he designed a cover for him. I would love to find that cover and find that issue. Probably might know where it is, certainly better than I would if it still exists. So a few other biographical details. Sidney, by the time, or I should say before, he had reached the age of 30. I'm sort of skipping ahead and I'm going to sort of cut back and forth between these different narrative threads. He had gotten married, had a kid. He co-founded and directed Anthology Film Archives, finished his PhD, got his first job working as a full-time professor, and of course published his first book. Again, all this before he was 30. So yeah, it's a little bit embarrassing, isn't it? That first book, which you probably all already know, is a book called Visionary Film. And that first book, or the first edition of that book, was published in 1974. So it's really, like the title, it's really a visionary book. It's a visionary work. And it's now in its third edition here in the 21st century. And this is the book that really, for so many people, I think, I'm sure so many people would agree, it really defined what the United States avant-garde, film avant-garde was for so many people. It was one of the really canonical texts. It's in my opinion, probably one of the great works of canon formation in the history of cinema studies. And the people that he was writing about, whether it's Maya Deren or Brackett, who I mentioned, Kenneth Anger, Jack Smith, Jonas Mekas, Bruce Conner, Mark Coppola, so on and so forth. The European great directors from the pre-war and the post-war periods, and also American or United States directors and film artists from the pre-war period. He was writing about all these people. The book grew, obviously, through multiple editions. He added chapters, added studies. But the idea is that, as Tom Gunning, who I can quote, another really important film theorist, researcher, professor, and figure, he called it, quote, the canonical account of its topic, and it really is. I have another quote for you from my former professor, David James at the University of Southern California. He calls Sidney, quote, the dean of American film historiography. Not the dean of avant-garde historiography. I mean, the dean just in general of American film historiography. That's a pretty strong endorsement, a pretty strong claim, I would say. So when we talk about the dean, as he was called, he actually landed in Yugoslavia in the summer of 1967. So this is going to be a very important year for us to talk about. And this summertime of 1967 is going to be a really important moment for us to talk about. So when he arrived, okay, again, he was young. He wasn't 19. I'll talk about some of his other activities in between these dates, these teenage years in 1967. So this was really before his own, I guess, legend was born. And of course, 1967, during this time on the film scene in socialist Yugoslavia, there was a new generation of film artists who were, I guess, also in the process of crafting their own legends and their own mark on the world, their world and the wider world. So 1967. Okay, so just to cut back and forth a little bit, I want to now talk about what was going on in the 1960s on the film scene in Yugoslavia. Not everything, but just a few important points that I want to use to sort of set the stage so we all know where we are, what we're talking about, what we should be talking about and thinking about when we talk about this moment. There's a lot of things, but I just want to go through a few key ones, certainly for the benefit of those who hopefully are maybe not so familiar with this territory, like I think a lot of you are. The story, I guess, should begin with talking about the history and the culture of kinoclubs. So these film clubs that were initiated, that were state run and sort of state sponsored, I guess, state finance, literally sort of stipulated by the state to be created. The film clubs were important cultural sites. They were important production sites. They were important sites of kino enthusiasm, really. They were really these charged spaces that have become almost mythical, I would say, in the ensuing years, for the amount of wonderful people that came through them and the amazing things that were happening in terms of production, in terms of exhibition, in terms of film festival organization, and in terms of publishing, so many different things, so many amazing things, so many cross-disciplinary partnerships, cross-border partnerships. So when we talk about the history of these clubs in Yugoslavia, which was a very unique history and a very specific history, similar in some ways, but very unlike other nations or regions that would have had clubs, whether they were east of the Berlin Wall or west, whether they were called societies or clubs or whatever they may be. But when we talk about Yugoslavia, the key and I guess the crucial clubs, the ones with the longest histories, and maybe the most people sort of circulating and working within them, certainly the ones that have been researched the most and written about the most, that would have been Belgrade Kino Klub and also Kino Klub Zagreb. And we could also add to this continuum probably Academic Kino Klub, which was founded a little bit later, also situated in Belgrade, but there were a host of others. There were basically clubs in every republic, every major city, whether you were talking about Ljubljana, where there would have been multiple clubs, whether you were talking about Novi Sad or Sarajevo, Skopje, whatever, Titograd, there would have been clubs everywhere. So yes, these were really, really important sites. When we think about the film artists that came through these spaces, whether it was Dusan Makavejev or Tomislav Gotovac, Jelimir Žilnik, who I think is out there somewhere listening to us in this virtual space, Nicola Stojanovic, Mihail Pansini, Karpo Godina, so many people, and I'm just really scratching the surface here. When we think about these clubs, amateur in the sense that, not in sort of this, I would say, vulgar or popular sense of the term of somebody that maybe doesn't know what they're doing, or somebody that's not quite a professional, or somebody that's on a level lower. I would say more amateur in the true sense of the term of someone who loves, a true enthusiast, someone whose heart and soul is into this, whose whole spirit and will is into this. And that's what they were, and that's what these film non-professionals were all about. Some of them eventually became professionals, but that's what they were all about at that time. So we have to talk about the clubs as the first sort of important ground that sort of birthed a lot of these things that Sidney stepped into when he stepped onto Yugoslav soil. So we can talk about the clubs. Something else that I want to talk about, two more specific things regarding this context, would be Pula as a city, as a film festival, as a space, and also GEF as a film festival, as a space, as a site of convergence for so many things. I should probably start out talking about GEF because of its close connection to the film club. So for those that don't know, GEF, GEFF, was one of the pioneering festivals of alternative film, or experimental, or avant-garde, or whatever you might like to call it. One of the pioneering festivals, not just in the country, not just in the region or Europe, but in the world, quite honestly. GEF was actually founded in 1963, and it was founded in Zagreb by members of Kino Klub Zagreb, specifically Mihail Pansini and some of his collaborators and followers. We'll get into that also. 1963 is also one of these really important and sort of fortuitous years, just thinking about film festivals alone. I read a recent article that was looking at the history of the clubs and GEF and different things that were happening. Good article, but sort of erroneously cited GEF as the first anywhere in the world, the first festival of its type anywhere in the world. That's not true. It's close. But in 1963, you also had Ann Arbor Film Festival in the United States that was founded, which some people maybe like to call the first or the oldest, but that's also maybe a disputable claim in terms of alternative film history, alternative film festival histories. So you had GEF, you had Ann Arbor. We also have to talk about Knock Le Zout in Belgium. We have to talk about Experimental, that festival, which also had an edition in 1963, which actually was initiated prior to 63. But prior to 63, it wasn't actually really a standalone film festival. It was sort of a portion of a larger event. It was a section, not quite a sidebar, something not quite independent, but still it wasn't quite a full-fledged festival. But technically, they were in operation before 1963. All those things were happening in 63, and also you had the founding of the New York Film Festival in 1963. So there were a lot of things going on in 1963 in terms of international film festival culture. But GEF, what we're most concerned and most interested in today, for the purpose of this presentation, in this research, was a space where I guess not just club members, certainly, I would say probably a majority would have been involved or connected somehow to the clubs, whether they were active or whether they were just friends, collaborators, whatever. But those that were interested in film, not only as an art form, but also that were interested in, again, these sort of cross-disciplinary fertilizations and ideas. Film as sort of a living, breathing form that could touch so many different areas of life. Certainly not necessarily mainstream film, whether it was short films, whether it was films that could be classified as hybrid or whatever sort of term we would like to put on it. So GEF was really a space to celebrate this kind of film, this sort of alternative and radical current in film culture. Now, there were other film festivals prior to that in socialist Yugoslavia that were, for example, connected to the clubs. A lot of clubs had their own film festivals, and there were a lot of Republican festivals, whether it would be the Kino Klub enthusiasts from Croatia or from Serbia or wherever. And a lot of those festivals would obviously be showing a lot of short films, a lot of avant-garde work, a lot of work that couldn't easily fit within this sort of title or that sort of category. So, but the idea is that GEF was probably the culmination of a lot of these impulses. In some ways, it might have been the climax. There were only 4 editions of GEF. So it was structured as a biennale. 1963 was the first edition. There was an edition in 65. There was an edition in 67 where Sydney landed also, that I'll talk about briefly. And the 69 edition had to be delayed to 1970. So there were 4 editions. And the first edition sort of initiated out of something that I wish I had a lot more time to talk about, but I don't. Maybe Pavle will, we'll see. But when we talk about Mihovil Pansini, one of these important figures from Kino Klub Zagreb, also one of these important kino enthusiasts, one of the things that I think he's probably remembered for, in addition to his amazing films, is the fact that he sort of initiated and theorized and practiced something that he called anti-film. And this anti-film initiative or mode or way of thinking, way of being, way of moving with the camera was something that he also took as a structuring point for GEF, for this initial idea for GEF. So GEF celebrated different themes in these different years. And when we talk about anti-film and GEF, we can sort of talk about the beginning. So again, anti-film is a radical film form, a radical thought, and sort of connecting with GEF and sort of breathing life into this space. So there is one other thing that I want to mention. Okay, so moving from GEF, before we talk more specifically about it and what types of people were there, what was shown there, not to go too far into GEF, but I also want to talk a little bit about the 1960s, specifically 1965 in Pula. So when we talk about the city of Pula, we talk about the film festival. This was sort of the main Pula Film Festival. This was the main national film festival in Yugoslavia. It was the largest festival, sort of the industry festival where the big feature films would have played, where all the big stars would have come out and been invited to, where Tito would have been hanging out and sipping champagne or smoking cigars or whatever he was doing. But also, and not only was Pula a space where sort of repetitions were made, where you could be, you could. There was literally a launching pad where whether we talk about Novi film, sort of the new film tendencies in Yugoslavia, or whatever we talked about, you had to pass through the crucible of Pula if you were making feature-length films in Yugoslavia. So there were basically the whole industry was there. But in 1965, there was a special edition, meaning an add-on to Pula, that was called MAFAF, MAFAF, which is probably, I guess for me, the most difficult acronym in the history of Yugoslav cinema. MAFAF was also called Little Pula, which is, I think, a better name. It's a little bit easier. I don't even know what the full acronym means, MAFAF. I think it's Međuklubski Autorski Festival Alternativnog Filma or something like that. The Interclub Festival of Auteurs and alternative film. It's a lot. But basically, MAFAF was a space in 1965 that was initiated, that was given over from the Pula Film Festival as a space to sort of unite these clubs and to bring these clubs together, whether they could show their films or talk about each other's works, meet each other, so on and so forth. So MAFAF was kind of another one of these gathering points, I guess, like GEF. It came after GEF, the first edition of GEF, but it was really important also for uniting these kino clubs from all over the country where people were showing their works and meeting each other. And again, obviously, a lot of these works would have been alternative works, or they would have been short works more often than not, maybe unclassifiable works. But again, MAFAF as a really unique and creative space within this larger and very much industry-based film festival. So we had to talk about that. All these things happening. So the point is, when setting this stage and kind of laying out this playing field of what was going on, when Sidney arrived in Yugoslavia in 1967, when he arrived in Pula specifically, when he arrived in Croatia specifically, and so many things were going on there, you could really say that he stepped into a really advanced film culture. There were so many things going on, so many different tendencies, and so many different sort of activities, and again, collaborations. He stepped into a really fertile ground. I don't know how much he knew about that or not. He knew some of the key actors and some of the key people, obviously, that invited him. But yeah, he stepped into a really unique and important situation. And what he specifically stepped into was something that was improvised. So everything that I want to talk about today mostly connects to one particular space, one particular moment, and one sort of particularly, I guess, improvised or unexpected happening. This was 1967, the summer of 1967, during the Pula Film Festival, when P. Adam Sidney was invited by Dusan Makavejev to come over from Italy. He was in Venice, not at the Venice Film Festival, because that would have been in September. I can't remember what exactly he was doing in Venice at the time. And I actually don't even know what Dusan Makavejev was doing in Venice at the time. But anyway, he invited him over. I'm sure the conversation was something like this. Hey, we got a great festival that's going on. We got Mafaf, we got all kind of interesting things. We have GEF, but since you're close by, why don't you come over to Pula, and then you can meet some people, you can show some films, maybe, what do you have? What are you interested in it? And Sidney was immediately interested, but the only thing that he had with him at that moment was a suitcase full of 8mm films by Stan Brakhage. For those of you that know Brakhage, in his history, you know that at around this moment, he turned to 8mm and made a series of films that were called The Songs, I believe 1 through 25. I think number 23 was The Psalm, that lasted a little bit more than an hour, but most of these were short 8mm works that Brakhage started making, and Sidney had those. So what I want to say is this legendary film happening, this meeting, this introduction, this first introduction, the first real direct introduction of the United States avant-garde film culture in Yugoslavia, with P. Adam Sidney as the ambassador, and his hotel room literally in Pula as the site. It consisted of a screening of what was in his briefcase, what was in his suitcase at that moment. And that just happened to be Stan Brakhage films. So that's what the guys saw. So basically, the men and the women, I should say, because I want to talk a little bit about who was in that room also, and sort of who witnessed really this first contact. So specifically, when I spoke with Sidney and asked him, okay, well, how did you get to Yugoslavia? I understand that you met Makavejev and so on and so forth, but tell me a little bit about the trip. He said, well, what I did was I took a train to Trieste, to Trst. And then he realized that he wasn't going to be able to get a train from there to Pula. So he decided to hitchhike. He was with his wife. He got married again at a very young age, and he was with his wife at that time. So he decided to hitchhike, and he eventually found his way to Pula, but not before he got robbed. So that kind of left a lasting and sort of mark on him, and he sort of remembers it very, very clearly. And not to put a black stain on Yugoslav culture and people, you can get robbed anywhere, right? But one of the interesting things to me is when we sort of circle back and talk about Brakhage and these 8mm films, for those that know, you know that the reason Brakhage turned to 8mm was because when he was in New York and he had a 16mm equipment in his car got robbed. His car was broken into and his stuff was stolen. He wanted to replace his equipment, didn't really have the money for it, but figured out that he could buy an 8mm camera for a little bit less, buy some film for, also a relatively nice or easy cost, and continue on with his work. So yeah, the spirit of, I guess, robbing somehow is connected to these 8mm films, which is maybe something else that we can sort of dive into a little bit later when we sort of open up the conversation. So Sidney somehow makes it to Pula, makes it to the hotel, and makes it to his idea, or I guess maybe it was Machiavell's idea, that we should set up a screening. Where would we do it? We'll do it in the hotel room. He put up sheets over the windows. Machiavelli sort of assembled the guest list, and these films played from morning to evening, according to certain testimonies. Discussions were had. People sort of met each other, and yeah, this is sort of the major case study that I want to talk about right now. So that's the first entrance of P. Adam Sidney and the United States avant-garde film culture into Yugoslavia. There was a second and more sustained entrance, an actual tour that I want to talk about. But before I do that, I would like to give you all a few anecdotes and a few sort of direct testimonies from some people that were connected to that moment, that were connected actually to this event and sort of the things surrounding it, even if they weren't actually at this event. And I'll talk more about the event in a little bit. So if you'll bear with me, I want to give you a few testimonies. The first one that I would like to give you some information on or from is from a colleague and a friend named Dragomir Zupac, who is an important figure that was involved with the clubs, involved with going to film school with a lot of these guys, sort of growing up with a lot of these guys in film culture. I eventually turned to directing, also worked in television for a number of years, and still to this day, very closely and heavily involved with post-Yugoslav, I guess we can say now, film culture. So I talked to Dragomir and sort of asked him a little bit about that moment and that time, and just sort of what was going on and sort of what was in his mind, and by extension, his colleagues' minds in general. And one of the first things that he told me when I asked him, okay, what was the beginning? What was sort of the real introduction, or sort of what was the first, I guess, sort of what was the breath of fresh air that was coming from United States film culture that you remember? And for him, it was actually Shadows, the film Shadows, which was made in 1959, I guess shot in 1958 and remade and released in 1959 by John Cassavetes, which is sort of one of these legendary films that's kind of been absorbed within this tradition of the underground or the avant-garde or the new American cinema. For him, it was Shadows. That was the first real blow of new American cinema for him in Yugoslavia. And he remembers that film being shown at the Kinoteka in Belgrade in the mid-1960s, so not immediately when it was released. And it was considered part of the American underground, like I mentioned. So for him, it gave him and some of his colleagues a unique and I guess a really sort of direct view of working independently, of shooting in the streets, working with 16 millimeter, and this sort of formal innovation, this formal freedom that they felt drawn to somehow. And certainly also, I think, this particular film, with its heavy use of jazz music and jazz culture, not just music, but the culture and the people and sort of these activities around jazz, I think that would have resonated very, very strongly and very nicely with people that were involved in the Kino Club set. The reason is, I have another anecdote, if you'll let me cut back for a moment. I remember I was talking a number of years ago, a long time ago, to Marko Babac, who was one of these important figures in the Kino Club movement, longtime editor and film director and professor. And when I was talking with him and researching the clubs and sort of trying to learn what they were like, what did the clubs, what do they feel like? What did the spaces literally look like? What do they smell like? And he told me, okay, well, Greg, there's two things that you should know if you wanted to know about the clubs, at least in my time, in my era. And he's one of the old school guys. So he was around and sort of one of the early members of Kino Club Belgrade back when it was first starting in the 1950s. He said, there's two things that you have to understand that you would have known, that would have marked us, that you would have been able to pick us out immediately. Or if you were walking by us on the street and sort of glanced into the window, you could have known immediately it was us. And he said the first thing was cigarette smoke, and the second thing was jazz music. That was it. Now, when we talk about jazz and American culture and music and sort of progressive forms and how it intersected with film We think about people like Tomislav Gotovac and others, not just him, but he's really sort of a canonical example. That's a whole other ball of wax that I don't really want to go into right now. But I just wanted to sort of connect this idea of jazz, and again, this idea of different forms of American culture, of United States culture, that really resonated. So going back to Zupanc in his testimony, he remembers the 1967 hotel room screening. He remembers Sydney. He remembers his characteristic beard. I think we actually have some pictures that are ready to go that I'm going to hopefully be able to pop up and show you in just a moment. Actually, our dear colleague Ljubica will be sort of handling that technical setup for us. But we'll show you a few images that come courtesy of Pavle. Thank you, Pavle, for those images. Hello, if you are, and hopefully you'll jump into the conversation a little bit later and maybe tie up some loose ends for us. And then Zupanc also remembers Sydney's 1968 screenings at the Kinoteca, this second part of his Yugoslav tour that I'm going to talk about a little bit more. So he remembers seeing the films of Jonas Mekas and Stan Brakhage, Andy Warhol, all these guys. Suffice to say, he really described it and remembers it as a feeling of total freedom. That's what he sort of got from the films. That's what he remembers from the films in terms of sort of boiling it down to an essence. We'll talk more specifically about specific directors and films a little bit later. I'm also being mindful of time, so I'm going to try to move a little bit more quickly through these next few testimonies before we pass over to our colleague Pavle. So the second testimony that I wanted to share with you all comes from Boshidar Zetrovic, who was also a really important figure in film culture at the time and still now, obviously doing a lot of great work, but also like Sydney, I think he was one of these young child prodigies at least in terms of Yugoslav film culture. So basically, who was Zetrovic? He's probably most known from the work that he did in establishing and sort of leading, organizing, and growing the Film Forum, which was an important film program that took place at Student Cultural Center when it was founded from April 1971 all the way until 1976, when Zetrovic stopped working for them and moved along to the Kinoteca and doing other things. The first program that he actually did at the Film Forum was a program on New American film, New American cinema. That was the first program in 1971. And by this point, he was able to get film prints from the Kinoteca. So the Kinoteca had some copies of some of these films, and a lot of those copies are obviously still in the collection. I haven't been able to get to them to research them yet, but I will. I'm on the path. So when we talk about Zetrovic and what he remembers, just to give you a few ideas, he was, first of all, he got his start in film culture as a teenager because he got into it through his family and through his friends. But he actually was a young film critic, and there was a film magazine, there was a magazine, a journal called Susret, Confrontations, and they had an open competition for young film critics or new film critics. The full-time film critic at that time would have been, if I'm not mistaken, sorry, I'm blanking on his name, Bogdan Tirnic. He would have been the full-time film critic there. But they set up a competition. It was a blind competition, and Zetrovic submitted his work for that competition, and he actually won. And what he won was an all-expenses-paid trip to Pula, to go to the festival, to cover the festival, to meet people, to write about the festival. So at that time, I believe he was only, I think, 17 years old, if I didn't miswrite this note. So again, another sort of young and I guess very impressionable individual who was circulating around this time. So what does he remember? He remembers actually that, again, Dusan Makavejev was the connection. He was the one that brought Sydney to Yugoslavia, that sort of knew him, that introduced him, that invited him. So he remembers him as the one. And coincidentally, just on a side note, when I talked with Zetrovic about Makavejev and about this sort of this crossroad, this intersection between Yugoslav film culture and United States film culture, avant-garde film culture. He mentioned Makavejev as really the true ambassador, the one that really sort of operated on both sides of the equation. So he was really one of the key connecting forces. We all know how important he is in general for his film art, for his writing, for his sort of interdisciplinary activities. But we also have to remember his importance as sort of a connecting point, somebody that really bridged these divides. So he remembers that. He remembers Sydney as a delegate of the American Federation of the Arts. He wasn't quite a delegate of the American Federation of the Arts because this tour that Sydney organized and went on was actually an initiative of the New American Cinema Group, which was the legal entity that Jonas Mekas ran, and Sydney was the treasurer. And they were the ones that ran the Filmmaker Cinematheque in New York, and eventually the ones, obviously, that founded Anthology Film Archives, for those that know that legendary institution. So he remembers that. He remembers the Hotel Riviera in Pula, where Sydney stayed. And he remembers how he put the sheets on the windows, and from the morning to the evening projected these films, projected these works. He remembers about 20 people in the room, a lot of young critics. Zetrovic was actually there with, he wasn't married then, but who would become his wife. He remembers Lazar Stojanovic was there. He remembers Stanislav Gotova, Sasha Makavejev, of course, and Bojana Makavejev. He remembers Vladimir Petek, Sava Trivkovic, the GEF crew, Pansini, who we mentioned. All the GEF guys were there. He remembers that the films that they watched at that moment were a shock. He was excited, really, that these kind of films existed, and he was really happy to be there and to see them. So he also recalls a lot of discussions that were happening on the terrace of the Riviera, and for him, the sum total of this kind of moment, this sort of cultural exchange and transference, was that the US avant-garde for him was really, really huge, not just formally, not just philosophically, but also politically. So this is something that he really kind of holds on to in terms of his memories and his influences. So the next testimony that I want to move along to is testimony from Slobodan Cihan, a really important film artist, film director, visual artist, also an outstanding writer, an award-winning arts writer, covering a lot of important things related to Yugoslav film culture and also working on a lot more. So Cihan was not actually in Pula, but he remembers the second leg of Sydney's tour, which I'm going to talk about in just a little bit. That would have been the 1968 leg. And that's when Sydney visited the Kinoteca, the National Cinematheque, not just in Belgrade, but also in the other republics, whether it be Sarajevo, whether it be Ljubljana, so on and so forth. So he remembers actually being at would have been the January 1968 screening in Belgrade at the Kinoteca. This would have been immediately after the December 1967 screenings that Sydney organized in GEF in Zagreb. Again, I'm jumping around a lot. I apologize for sort of this chronological mess, but I'll sort of try to come back and tie these things together. So the January 1968 screening. If the Pula screening was really the locus classicus, or sort of the first moment, sort of the first point of contact, this actual tour, this multi-city tour, would have been the most elaborate and obviously sort of the most extended showings of these new American cinema films. Basically, there was a package of about 40 or so hours of films that Sydney put together. So the programs were designed to run across a number of days. In this January 1968 screening, Cihan remembers that it was packed. He remembers there was a huge audience. Now, I want to cross back over to Sydney in an interview an unpublished interview, where he talks about this 1968 screening. And he mentions that there was 100 or so people in the audience, maybe, a little bit more. He remembers particularly that it was a strong audience, but he thought it was a really strange screening because he didn't get any reaction from anybody. He didn't get any questions from anybody. And that would have been strange for him, right? Because he was on tour all over the world, quite literally, with these films all these years. And you can imagine the different questions that he was getting, the different reactions that he was getting, sort of the eagerness to sort of connect and sort of to discuss. He didn't get any of that in the Belgrade Kinoteca screening. And he probably didn't really know why, but I actually found out what I think is the reason from Sheehan. So when you talk with him about this particular screening, he remembers it. It's a funny story to me. Sorry, it's actually hilarious to me. He remembers this film screening being advertised as the American underground film, underground films. Now, because of a slip up or sort of a non-precision, I guess, in translation or miscommunication or whatever we want to call it, he remembers that a lot of people mistakenly thought that they would actually be watching von Sternberg's gangster film Underworld, his classical, sort of one of the early gangster films, and all the other Hollywood gangster films that would have came after that. So that's what a lot of people were probably expecting to see at that screening. So you can imagine maybe this audience, if this is the case, of 100 or so people who maybe had no connection at all to any sort of tradition of alternative film, abstract film, sort of non-mainstream film, non-Hollywood film. And then you can imagine sort of what unfolded in front of their eyes actually at that screening. It's a very anti-film moment, to come back to Pansini and this idea of anti-film. And one of the things that he said, the impetus for this idea of anti-film was looking up at that screen and getting something totally unexpected or something that you're actually not ready for. For me, that's probably one of the great also anti-film moments in this history of Yugoslav film exhibition. So that's what he has, or that's what he experienced. So Sheehan remembers these U.S. films were a completely new thing when Sidney brought them, and they wouldn't have shown anywhere else in that area. You wouldn't have been able to see them unless you traveled to one of the other stops on the tour and in one of the other countries, or obviously unless you were in New York or in the United States. So a completely new thing. Now, another side note from Sheehan that I want to transmit that he would remind us is that when we talk about this connection in general, the first actual real connection, the first sort of real transference between the Yugoslav and the United States avant-garde, film avant-garde, actually would have been Slavko Vorkapić. He would have been sort of really the beginning. And if you'll remember, he traveled back to Yugoslavia after the war in the 1950s, lectured, deposited his films in the archive in 1951, and his films would have been screened quite regularly, as Sheehan remembers from Professor Dusan Stojanovic, who would show these films to his students. So there was a whole generation of Yugoslav film artists who would have came of age knowing about Vorkapić and his films, also maybe not as exemplars of the United States film avant-garde, but as sort of legendary and important works of the international film avant-garde. Vorkapić was their guy, and that was sort of a big homecoming for him. Okay, so the final testimony that I want to introduce you or relate to you before we end this segment is testimony from Sidney himself. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that he remembers and saw and experienced as a result of this activity. So when we talk about that, he remembers, first of all, meeting Dusan Makavejev and also Branko Vučićević, who's a very important figure that I don't think I got to speak much about before, but now is the time. He remembers actually meeting them in New York. And he would have met them, not for the first time. The first time would have been, obviously, when he was doing these Pula screenings in the summer of 67, but he would have met them in New York in September of 1967, and it would have been at the New York Film Festival, because at that time, Makavejev was doing the United States premiere of his early masterpiece, Love Affair, or The Missing Case of the Switchboard Operator. So they would have been in New York at that time. So that's the moment that Sidney remembers that they got the idea to invite him for this longer and larger tour of Yugoslavia, where he could show the full breadth of films that he wanted to, visit all the different cities, to visit Gef in December of 1967, and then to continue on throughout January and later in 1968 through all the other cities in the country. So again, Sidney assembled 40 hours worth of films to show, and he prepared a detailed schedule of screenings. So when we talk about these films and these filmmakers, it's the names that you probably all know. Again, whether it's Maya Deren, whether it's Kenneth Anger, whether it's Brakhage, whether it's Shirley Clark, Bruce Conner, Robert Greer, Van der Beek, Mary Minkin, Ken Jacobs, Bruce Bailey, so on and so forth. I won't name them all, but you get it. So these are the people that he showed. This is the canon, right? This is like literally the canon. Imagine seeing the canon all together, like for the first time in one space. It's kind of hard to sort of appreciate what that was or what that meant or sort of what that felt like as this history was being written in the process. But that was the canon. So again, these films were selected in collaboration with Jonas Mekas as the organizer and sort of underwriter through this New American Cinema group. So when he arrived to Zagreb, to GEF, in 1967, in December 1967, via Belgium and Paris, because he was actually at this other film festival that I mentioned, Experimental, which is another one of the pioneering alternative film festivals in the history of Europe and the history of international film culture. There was actually a number of problems. He had some problems with customs. The films got stuck. There was a strike in France on the railway, so films and people couldn't travel. There was a blizzard even in Croatia at the time, so that slowed things down. So basically, his original screening had to be sort of reconstituted and rescheduled and reassembled at a later moment. But the films were able to arrive and they were able to screen actually at GEF. So when we talk about this entire tour and this entire idea, I think Branko Vučićević now sort of steps to the front, to the forefront of this. And Branko Vučićević, for those that don't know, really important figure in the history of Yugoslav film culture, certainly in sort of avant-garde film culture, the sort of visual arts in general, film critic, editor, translator, film writer, script writer, and somebody who in many ways was the engine, the spark that made so many things go and connected so many of these legendary artists at that time, from Makavejev to Gotovac and all the way in between. So Vučićević was actually the one that sort of organized the travel and organized the print traffic. Not only that, Vučićević was the one that edited the film bulletin for GEF in 1967. And what he put together in that film bulletin was a selection of interviews and essays by and with Sidney and also Jonas Mekas, sort of speaking about this new American cinematic group, this new American cinema. So what does he remember besides all these problems with customs and getting the films actually into the country? He remembers specifically Vladimir Petek, who's one of the Zagreb Kino Club artists that I mentioned. He remembers that was his host. He was his host in Zagreb, and he really liked him a lot. They got on well, but there were some serious problems with language. There were a lot of language barriers. Sidney really remembers that clearly. And in fact, out of all his travels, he remembers throughout Europe, his most severe language barrier in Europe was in Yugoslavia. Because as he remembers, this would have been a time where people did not commonly speak English, didn't commonly speak French as he spoke. So he had a lot of difficulty communicating with people. That's something to keep in mind in terms of these sort of circumstances and different sort of happenstances and slip-ups and different things that we're mentioning. So yeah, all the people that he showed in that initial screening, and then moving along to the next part of the tour in Belgrade in January 1968, and remembering the audiences. He remembers also that he was treated really, really well. The red carpet was certainly rolled out for him. And in addition to Petek, his most cherished memory, the one that he connected with the most, probably because he spoke really good English, or at least good enough English. He didn't think his English was so great, but it was, would have been Vučićević. They spent a lot of time together. They ate a lot of meals together, and he specifically remembers eating at the Writers Club in Belgrade with him. He remembers their lunches, and he also remembers discussing Fluxus with Vučićević. And for those that know that history and know how he intersected with sort of this international Fluxus movement, that's something for, I think, further investigation. So he remembers all these discussions with him. Not so many details, but sort of just the general mood and the general topics. And again, this tour in early 1968 took him through Sarajevo, took him through Ljubljana, all the different sort of kinotecas that were represented in the republics of socialist Yugoslavia. He remembers that the audiences were always of varying capacities. at these different screenings. The largest audiences and probably the most eager would have been the Zagreb and Belgrade screenings as sort of the largest metropolis centers in the country at that time. In terms of his general remembrances and recollections and feelings about Yugoslavia at that moment in the 1960s, right, which was kind of sort of the golden age of socialist Yugoslavia, he felt people were really free and open. He specifically remembered that people weren't scared of the police. And that was interesting for him because he didn't have so much experience on the eastern half of the Berlin Wall. He did travel to Czechoslovakia, so he does remember that. But he particularly remembers that people didn't seem to be scared of the police. So the country felt very open to him and very welcoming to him. Now, regarding the artists that he met, a lot of them that I mentioned, some that I didn't have a chance to mention, when he remembers them and sort of their attitudes and their reactions, he felt like they were artists like everywhere that he went, which basically meant that they were mostly interested in their own work. They were interested in their own work, but specifically how their work would have related to these United States avant-garde films. That's what they were interested in. So he remembers and he knew basically that they had read a lot. A lot of people had read a lot about these films, so the reputations really preceded them when they arrived on whatever soil or whatever border they crossed. But as is often the case, as I'm sure a lot of you know, the films that they had built up in their imaginations were always better than what was projected in reality. So that's something that he kind of felt and that he was sensitive to. And I think really that this fetishized or this desired imaginary kind of, it could be an apt metaphor for us as we explore this influence and this impact of the U.S. avant-garde on Yugoslav arts and artists and sort of the implications of that impact as we continue on with this research project, this cross-disciplinary research project. So 3 things, very specifically. The first international exposition of the New American Cinema. That was a European tour, 1963, 1964. Again, Sydney was 19 at the time. Munich, Brussels, Stockholm, Amsterdam, Paris, London, Vienna, so on and so forth. The second international exposition, that was in Buenos Aires. That was in Argentina in 1965. And the third international was in Yugoslavia, 1967, 1968. There was no fourth tour. But again, some of the reasons for that were Sydney moving on to other challenges that I mentioned, such as writing his book, which was sort of obviously based on a lot of these filmmakers that he showed and sort of got really intimate with in terms of knowing their work and how it impacted different audiences, quite literally across the world. Starting his work as a professor, founding Anthology Film Archives, and all the other sort of minor footnotes in such an amazing and I guess legendary career. So yeah, that is basically what I would like to present to you in terms of this research in progress, and sort of filling in some of these gaps and these untold histories through a lot of anecdotal evidence, but also piecing together who, what, when, and where, which is always a really interesting topic and challenge for me that I'm looking forward to continuing with and sort of bringing to a close as we continue to work on this project and move into the second portion, which will happen later this year. That being said, I don't want to burden anymore. I would probably either throw it back to Branko first to introduce Pavle and his sort of response or his extension and supplementing to a lot of these gaps that I left open. And then we will continue the discussion. So thank you for your patience. And again, apologies for all the cross-cutting. I am a proud disciple of Branko Vučićević and Dušan Makapejev. Hvala.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg, very much. This was a very, very interesting mapping of the Sydney's activity related to Yugoslavia. As Branko Vučićević is mentioned, I was thinking when did I, for the first time, hear the name P. Adam Sydney, and when I read for the first time something by him. And then, of course, occurred to me that it was in this seminal book by Branko Vučićević, which I got when I was in first years of my studies of art history in the mid 80s. And this book ends with Sidney's essay on Joseph Cornell, who was for me an essential link, this kind of a strange character, and this kind of missing link between the Duchamp and Dada, the early avant-garde, and then the Bruce Conner, particularly, and the others in the 60s. So this was also one of the results of these relations of Branko Vučićević and Sidney. And of course, Branko Vučićević could be also a Schlagwort for Pavle Levi, but he will definitely pick from first of all from your presentation and your mapping of the situation. So Pavle, I would like to invite you to give us some comments and responses to Greg's presentation.
Thank you, Branko. Thank you, Greg, for that wonderful presentation. And first of all, let me just backtrack and thank the organizers, Branko, Ljubica, Anna, for inviting me to participate. As Branko pointed out, Greg, this was a very interesting mapping of some of the central events having to do with this really rich series and history of encounters between the two cultures, American and Yugoslav culture at large, more specifically American and Yugoslav film culture, and of course, most specifically, the topic of today, the two avant-gardes, the American and Yugoslav experimental film scenes. I think it's very important to emphasize, which you did actually, Greg, early on in your presentation, the ways in which this series of encounters were actually by no means, whether we're talking about Sydney or whether some other in the history of, local experimental film culture, monumental scene, these were not events that where, somebody brings about a set of completely unknown films or brings news of a culture that would have been completely unknown to the receiving culture. There was a general sense of openness towards experimental cinema in general in Yugoslavia since the early days, as you pointed out. And especially, as you stressed, there was, when Sidney arrived in Yugoslavia, he actually came into what is generally a familiar terrain, which is to say, amidst another existing and burgeoning experimental film culture. So in that sense, I think it's maybe interesting to backtrack a little bit even more. You were talking about Sidney's visits in the late 60s, 67, 68. I think it's important to point out that a full year earlier, in 1957 already, actually Branko Vučićević, whom you mentioned, had published a very interesting short piece in the Film Culture magazine. So this is November 1957, and the date is very interesting for a variety of reasons. It's a short text by Branko, which was actually recently published in that volume of his film criticisms, film critical writings that was put out by Filmski Centar Serbia. The text, which was originally published in English, because it was published in what were, according to Sidney himself, the formative years of Film Culture, the journal, which soon enough, in a couple of years only, would become one of the symbols of American avant-garde film culture in a very strong sense of the word, by which I mean avant-garde film culture that is organized, that has its people like Jonas Mekas, Sidney, who are writing its history, who are promoting it, who are working extensively on distribution, screenings of the films, etc. But in 1957, when Branko Vučićević publishes a short text, which is called Yugoslav Cinema Comes to Maturity, film culture is in its own formative years. It shows how much interest actually, this text shows a number of things already. It shows that early on there was an experimental film strain burgeoning in Yugoslavia already. Because this text, short as it is actually split in two. The first part is a kind of very synoptic account of some of the highlights of Yugoslav, let's call it mainstream cinema or commercial cinema, as Branko calls it, and without not at all in a pejorative sense. He talks there about Bauer's, Neokreći se sine, Pogačić, and others. But then the second part of this short text is explicitly labeled as an account of experimental film in Yugoslavia. And Branko says in it, there is a strong interest and burgeoning tendency of experimentation in Yugoslavia. And he points out a number of interesting players whom, Greg, you already mentioned in their subsequent roles, significant for the story which you wove again around Sydney. Branko mentions Pansini and Makavejev. He also mentions Boštjan Hladnik, his early film, Italia 1952, which he compares to early Jean Vigo. But more to the point here, he talks about Makavejev's Pečat, made in 1955, so 2 years before this film would be made. This text would be published in Film Culture. And he talks about Pansini's early film, Osuđenik, The Condemned, which is a remarkable film about the life of a rooster in a chicken coop, life and death of a rooster. So what this text shows is already some of the highlights of Yugoslav experimental cinema in these early days, 1950s. And it also demonstrates an interest on behalf of a burgeoning, organized American experimental film culture in developments elsewhere, which I think is a very interesting point. This is happening again in November 1957, which is just a year before the new American Cinema Group would actually be formed, the group which you referred to, and the formation of which was a founding gesture in the establishment of what I've been referring here to as American experimental film culture in the strong or organized sense. So these are the formative years, and this wonderful text, which maybe we can show a cover from this issue of Film Culture in which Branko's text appeared. Yeah, there it is. So this is the journal, Film Culture, which has been formed by Jonas Mekas, founded by Jonas Mekas only 3 years earlier in 1954, and which, as I said, in a matter of a few years would become a foremost forum for the expression of the experimental film culture in the United States. Now, by the time Sidney came to Yugoslavia, it's important in light of this to point out that he was not only promoting various filmmakers and their films, but he was promoting an already very coherent and organized group and a movement, the New American Cinema. Very interesting, and in a way, I think very typical or not at all unusual, to me at least, that when you referred to Zupanc and his recollection of those days, that it was Shadows by John Cassavetes that came up, because this was a film which was indeed central in these developments. It was a film that was central in the development of the New American Cinema, the New American Cinema Group, which would then lead to the formation of the Filmmakers Cooperative in New York, the foremost means of distributing these experimental films. John Cassavetes was, in fact, one of the New American Cinema Group. Because what was very interesting is that at that time, 1959 and 1960, before the first statement of the New American Cinema Group would be published in early 1961, I believe, the group had consisted of people like Jonas Mekas and his brother Adolfas Mekas, John Cassavetes, Shirley Clark, and others. And what motivated, and film culture was already being, already functioning as a vehicle for their voices. What was so interesting is that the model they wanted to develop, that they were hoping to develop, was not the model that would be developed and what American experimental or avant-garde cinema would become famous for. They had rather wanted to establish a means of making what they called truly independent films in the United States that would actually be modeled after something that we know as a European model along the lines of how films were being made, for example, by Godard, Truffaut, and others in the early days of the Nouvelle Vague, the French New Wave. So a kind of professional, if you will, cinema that would be low budget and that would allow for complete artistic, creative, and otherwise expression that would not be part of Hollywood proper, but that would also not be underground. This was the time when Jonas Mekas was making or had already made his first film Guns of the Trees. This is the time when Shadows had been made, and it was hailed by Mekas as the example of the aspiration, the filmmaking aspiration that the new American cinema group wanted to institutionalize. This is also when the next film would be Pull My Daisy by Frank and Leslie, which is about the Beat generation, beatniks. And these are all films that have that kind of art cinema quality to them and aspiration that is not something that we associate with, again, the kind of films that new American cinema, underground film, etc. in the US would become famous for, nor the films that Sidney would bring to Yugoslavia and elsewhere with his kind of traveling film circus, Brakhage, Warhol, Bruce Bailey, Conner, and others. Why am I insisting on this? Because I think one interesting peculiarity of Yugoslav cinema or Yugoslav avant-garde and experimental tendencies is that this interesting cross-fertilization with American cinema or American experimental tendencies, as, for that matter, cross-fertilization that it underwent with other experimental film cultures, such as the London experimental culture. This cross-fertilization, given the circumstances in Yugoslavia, the nature of film industry, the place of film culture in Yugoslav socialist society, etc., it actually always had a twofold bent. On the one hand, you had, as you, Greg, actually referred in passing in your comments, you had the first generation of people like Makavejev, like even Boštjan Hladnik, whom I mentioned in passing because of Branko Vučićević's text, like Branko Vučićević himself and others who were always very interested in experimental filmmaking, whose early films, if they were amateur and kino club filmmakers, were rather experimental, but who would make their way into professional filmmaking. And as they made their way into professional filmmaking industry, film industry proper, the experimental tendency would also be retained. So in a certain sense, people like Dušan Makavejev at his, most accomplished films like Nevinost bez zaštite or WR Mysteries of the Organism are actually films that belong to that one category of avant-garde where you have a lot of experimentation, a lot of creative freedom, but these are actually, relatively speaking, big budget films, and they're certainly supported by the industry. On the other hand, you also have, as you, Greg, so nicely pointed out, a long history of experimental filmmaking more akin to what would become the model associated with American experimental scene, and that is what in Yugoslav context retained its name and legacy of amateur filmmaking, outside the industry, outside the professional context proper, which is not to say that it was any inferior creatively, aesthetically, etc. But the mode of production was different. And there is that history as well. And the point that I'm driving at here is that these two types of avant-gardes, as Peter Wallen would call them, the avant-garde that is, on the one hand, really outside the professional commercial context, and on the other hand, the avant-garde that is more big budget, part of the industry, more narrative in its orientation, they would themselves intertwine ways in which Yugoslav experimental film culture was interacting with various other influences, including the United States. So one of the foremost representatives, actually, of the properly, if you will, independent, experimental, in the strong sense of that term, tendency has always, in the context of Yugoslavia, been Tomislav Gotovac, foremost exemplar of experimentation that did not take place in the context of film industry proper. But we also know as of recently, or not as of recent, well, we know as of recently more than we knew, but we also as of recently have had access to, thanks to Slobodan Šijan and others, to the films of Vukica Đilas, which are a strong manifestation of that other avant-garde, which is akin to some of the key tendencies in New American cinema. Maybe we can show here another image, which I am very fond of, and that is, I've had a great pleasure and opportunity to show films of Vukica Đilas to P. Adams Sydney. Only last year, actually, in 2012. Yes, this is the image. This is a private screening I organized for Sydney of the films of Vukica Đilas a year ago. When he was visiting, we had organized a talk for him. And so here he is watching these films. And I initially said, let me show you a little bit, maybe. He said, yes, of course. He wanted to see everything that I had, which was about an hour-long selection of Đilas's films, which he found fascinating. And he really had only positive things to say about them. And this, I think, means a great deal from a figure such as Sydney, who, let it be added here, is a foremost also theorist of the genres of experimental filmmaking, and somebody who in particular, in reference to Jonas Mekas, about whom he had written extensively, had used the term films of quotidian poetry, referring to a special kind of home movies, diary films. And it was Sydney who actually very, of his own volition, very directly acknowledged that when referring to my comment that I think here is finally strong evidence of Yugoslav experimental cinema having always had its own equivalent of Jonas Mekas in Vukica Đilas, he said, yes, but of course, these are in many ways also different films. And they're different because my point here being that they are comparable to a certain tendency in American avant-garde cinema, namely the diary films of Jonas Mekas, but they're also distinct in the way Vukica Đilas shot them. Only very few frames per shot, etc., etc. So it's a wonderful example, kind of bracketing this from the other end of this history of encounters, if you will, between the two experimental cultures, and mutual acknowledgement of the fact that there are many similarities, there are many ways in which actually categories of one can even be mapped across the other, but how also in very interesting ways these two experimental film cultures have always retained their own genuine, kind of authentic and unique, distinct sensibilities, stylistically and otherwise. And as a concluding remark, I do not want to take too long because I'm sure there must be questions and comments from others, but maybe we can turn to another photograph here, which is from the 70s. And it's the cover of a book, which is one of those books that at that time used to be published very often, which we no longer, it's a kind of genre that died out. And these are the books published based on films, ex post facto. So here is W.R. Mysteries of the Organism, after the film had already been made, of course. And this is the front page of the book, sitting next to a book of Wilhelm Reich's. And the dedication here is from Makavejev to Carolee Schneemann in 1974 in New York. So you have touched upon, again, I'm trying to follow, Greg, your itinerary here, and just to add a little bit more to it in a still wider historical and contextual lens. Sidney had visited Yugoslavia by 1967-68, as you pointed out. He had found there a rich experimental film culture, the importance of GAF. As much as we talk about it, it's never enough. In a way, I think it cannot ever be underappreciated. GAF stood for a Yugoslav version, if you will, of the culture, which by this time, Sidney was an active proponent of developing in the US context. And another visitor to GAF was also Carolee Schneemann a little bit later. She herself also, she found herself also in a very amicable environment in that sense. I just find this image that we had on the screen interesting because it's a foremost sign, or one of the foremost expressions, I would say, of this amicability of the two, between the two experimental film cultures. Because here is a dedication from one Cine Reichian, of course, Makavejev, who became the namesake of that, to another Cine Reichian. Because Carolee Schneemann, too, by this time, 1974, she had made some of her best-known films, including Fuses, which was in the late 60s, and like many intellectuals and artists, progressive intellectuals of that time, late 60s and early 70s, Schneemann, too, was very much influenced by Reichian brand of psychoanalysis. This was not perhaps as explicit or as didactically stated in her films, but it was rather explicit in the fact that these were films that were linking sexuality, cinema, and radical politics, in her case, feminism. They were tying them together. Why the year is interesting, 1974, because this is the time when Makavejev and Branko Vučićević are actually in New York together. This is not the first time, but it is an interesting time because it's also their joint visit to New York that is actually in part documented in Vukica Đilas's films. In fact, this is the segment where Vukica Đilas is not present, presumably because they took her camera to New York and then filmed each other. Branko Vučićević, Makavejev, and Bojana is actually Marian there too. So this is when the two of them, Branko and Mak, are working on a screenplay for a film which was never realized. And this is the time when they are interacting yet again, or still, with some of the avatars of American avant-garde film culture of that time, including Schneemann. Only a year earlier, this is significant very much in the history of Yugoslav film culture, 1973 was an important year. This is when, this is a year which in a way symbolized the end, the suppression of certain black wave tendencies. And a year earlier, another key figure, this is not a very well-known fact at all, but another key figure of American avant-garde film culture, again, in that strong and by that time already very organized sense, had visited Yugoslavia. And that was Annette Michaelson, who is a foremost theorist of many of these American experimental film tendencies, who was one of those New York-based film scholars, intellectuals, art historians, who herself was very interested in Yugoslavia as an alternative, as you said, to the Eastern Bloc, a socialist country that was not part of the bloc, that had already acquired a good name for itself, if you will, in promoting its own, pursuing its own version of a path, along the path of socialism. In 1973, Annette Michaelson went to Pula. And this account is also fascinating because she traveled inspired, wanting to see this country. And in Pula, she ends up actually witnessing the award ceremony to Sutjeska, Stipe Delić's film, which was, in a certain sense, the symbolic end of the Black Wave tendency, the assertion of more of a hard line, if you will, in cinema again. And there's this account, this verbal account I have of Annette Michaelson being shocked to see Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Barton walking down the steps in Pula, Elizabeth Taylor wearing some kind of princess-like tiara, and all of this happening in this socialist country that she went to visit because of all of these interesting things she had learned about. But she had also established a relationship with Dusan Makavejev. In 1974, in that image we saw, among the people they were fraternizing with, Annette Michaelson was part of that broader circle too. And only a year or two later, one of the first class that Dusan Makavejev would teach at an American university would be at NYU, New York University, and he would teach about Reich and cinema. So it's very interesting how these things are intertwined, again, to conclude my comments, in ways that are moving back and forth across the Atlantic.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Paula, very much, especially for stressing this twofoldness of this process that we are talking about. It is very important for us, not only about this particular case study, but in general, not to understand this notion of the influence as something which is linear, where there is a kind of transmitter and a receiver, but it's a kind of more complicated creative process, what you stressed with the examples that you will give us. Greg, would you like to add something? Yeah?
Yeah, I want to add something. Just thank you, Pavle, first of all, for the brilliant intervention. 1974, I just want to close the literary circle because there's a few more amazing things. One we already talked about was Visionary Film, which was published in 1974. And the second thing was the iconic book, Film as a Subversive Art by Amos Vogel, who, of course, featured Dusan Makavejev's WR on this very well-known cover. So 1974 is already shaping up to be a wonderful topic for an essay on these literary arts with these three sort of books and these three covers. I think it's that's already fascinating.
As it happens, we took more time than that, but it was so interesting, so I didn't want to interrupt anyone. But given that we are already the 90 minutes online, I think it's kind of the right time and a good time to ask others who have joined our discussion to make their comments, ask questions to our panelists. Alexandra, would you like to be the first one with the comment, the question?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I'm very happy to hear this very nice start, as Greg mentioned, of this research. I was really eager to hear because last year our guest at Physical Cinema was Professor John Sundholm from Stockholm, who was also doing this research on Sydney's European tour. And I remember how hard it was for him to find any kind of documented documents about that would help him in his research. So I'm interested in your research. Have you stumbled upon some of the some documents that we couldn't find at the time, like 6 months ago? Was there something that we missed, or that's very interesting how hard it was also, how everything was based on this anecdotal oral histories, and we were really trying to help this research going, considering the related to Yugoslav part of Sydney's European activities. And I was very eager to find out more, but I was hoping that you will, as a very thorough researcher, maybe find more. And it's very good that you had a chance to talk with all the related people from Yugoslavia and Sydney himself, I think. Another thing is, I'm always interested in those not so obvious continuities of those exchanges and influences. And it was almost something like a given framework for the generation I'm in the 1990s. It was a huge, let's say, friendship and cooperation between micro-cinema movement in the USA and Lofa Video in Serbia. We even in the darkest times got experimental film programs called the International Exposure from Black Chair Productions. So for me, it's interesting how much longer continuities of those practices that maybe are continuities, maybe they're just happening in different points in time, can be maybe observed more thoroughly, and maybe some other connections could come up. Well, we are all connected by Macaveyev, obviously, who inspired my movement in the 90s also. But those two questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Alexandra. Greg?
Okay, thank you, Tsato, for the questions. Thank you for being here. And so as far as I understand, first specifically related to John and his research, I don't know, is he in the session? He was invited, and I hope he's there somewhere. Also, I'm not sure how to figure out where the contributors are or where the list of people is as I'm talking. I don't want to mess up the feed. But as far as I understand, his research is at an early stage, but also primarily, again, document-based, as you mentioned. And the thing that's interesting for me is with, this event that hasn't been documented, that wasn't documented, and that the only thing we really have is anecdotal evidence. And that was my starting point, is try to sort of piece together this screening, what really happened, who was really there. And obviously there's a lot of slippages in memories. So I'm trying to sort of triangulate and figure out, basically through anecdotal evidence, what hasn't been recorded. Now, obviously we do have more tangible evidence in terms of the 1968 tour, specifically going to these different cities and the programs and the text that Sidney wrote. His dossier, or I guess his communique from Europe to film culture in New York about what was happening and what was going on. So that exists. But yeah, my sort of priority at this early point is trying to piece together this history through this very precious anecdotal evidence of a lot of figures that are still around, that remember these people and remember these events. And I'm so thankful that they are around. And these anecdotes need to be properly documented, I think. So yeah, that's sort of the starting point for me before I even get to some of the more hardcore data and documentation that does exist and that people obviously have been able to access. That's the first part of your question. Actually, the second part was a lot wider.
Second part was more of a comment.
Yeah. But the connections, and it's fascinating, all the fortuitous connections. Not fortuitous, I guess nothing's really an accident, but like we just mentioned, 1974, all those things that were happening just in terms of books alone that connected all these people that knew each other, obviously, and circulated around each other, whether in the United States, whether in Yugoslavia, whether in Europe. So yeah, these connections are, it's just the fascinating part of the research, just realizing how, I'm sorry, I have one more thing to say about these connections. And also sort of piggybacking on what Pavle mentioned about Carly Schneemann. So I had sort of the luck and the pleasure really to have dinner with her in Detroit, actually, probably 6 to 9 months before she passed away. And we started up a really brief but really nice email exchange. And one of the things that she actually asked me when we had dinner was about Usha Makavejev. Now, at that point, I didn't know about this book that he dedicated to her. I didn't know so much about their connections. But she asked about him, and I mentioned how important he was to me and how kind he was in terms of my research and just sort of loving his films and obsessing over his work. And then she, to my surprise, she actually mentioned to me, well, I wrote something about Mysteries of the Organism. And I thought, okay, really? Did you? She said, yeah. So will you send it to me? She said, sure, I will. So her assistant emailed it to me, and she wrote a long, beautiful, wonderful text. It's almost epistolary, sort of an address to Makavejev, almost a letter to him, but really just what Pavle mentioned about this love for Reich and Reichian principles, and these avant-garde sort of formal principles, and how much this film, this Mystery of the Organism, really meant to her and people around her. I don't know where she published that text, but it's sort of, let's say, one of my most cherished email attachments in history of my emails.
Thank you, Greg. Alexandra Bošković, did you want to ask a question or comment?
Thank you all for organizing this. This is wonderful. I really enjoyed it. And thank you, Greg, for such a amazing research. And this kind of oral history is something that is becoming much more popular across the discipline. So I really appreciate the work and the time you put into this. And of course, thank you, Vlad, thank you, Pavle, for these comments. These are similar comments that I've heard in one of your presentations on Yugoslav avant-garde cinema in MoMA, for example. And I just want to ask a specific question regarding one of these comments. Namely, Pavle said that when Sydney came to Yugoslavia, there was already this familiar terrain, right, burgeoning film culture. And you, Pavle, mentioned this essay that Pavle Vučićević published in film culture. And what is interesting to me is that this double or twofold band between these two avant-gardes, that is obvious, even in Yugoslav context, is actually connected to that text. Namely, these two avant-gardes you talked about, Pavle, one being this first generation, more subversive, believing in film as a subversive mechanism, right? Political mechanism. And this other more avant-garde, low budget, more experimental culture. And then you mentioned, I remember in that presentation in MoMA, you mentioned that Vukica Đilas may be this missing link, right, between these two cultures. And now back to the text that you mentioned that Vučićević published in film culture, that is called The Yugoslav Film Comes to Maturity. It is interesting that the person who edited that journal, right, the monthly for motion picture, the editor-in-chief of that journal was Jonas Mekas. And I just have a question. Do you know, or either you or Greg, anything about how Vučićević met with Mekas and whether this connection with Mekas would help us to get maybe a better picture of the historical period that precedes Sydney's visit to Yugoslavia?
Thank you, Sasha. Greg, do you want to address this?
I think you're probably better to address this, actually. So, yeah, 1957, we know Vučićević and his life story and his professional story in terms of Fluxus, in terms of writing film criticism in this early moment in the 50s. That was pretty early in his career as a film critic, and before a lot of activities that he undertook. I don't know what his connection was to Mekas in New York in the mid-1950s. That's probably, that's a question for Pavle.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's a question that Pavle cannot answer properly and would not dare to claim to be able to do so in a session such as this, which is being recorded. But I can speculate a little, and I'll tell you why. Branko Vučićević was very much in the habit of establishing connections and maintaining correspondence with a variety of interesting avant-garde figures. And I'm assuming that the way he connected with the film culture people and Mekas in particular was through correspondence, literally. This is how he also got in touch with, eventually established contact with Maciunas, and also, which is not a very well-known fact, but it is verified, this is also how Branko had a short-lived correspondence with Guy Debord, which is also not very well known because in the correspondence, in the collected letters of Guy Debord, he is billed wrongly as, I think, a Czechoslovak critic whose name is Vukokević or something like that. So, but in any case, he had actually reached out on a number of occasions and established correspondence with some very interesting figures. This is not to say, though, that they have not met, Branko and Mekas, but they did not meet that early on in the 50s. I think the meeting would have taken place, I believe, in London at some point. And this is when Branko and Vukica Đilas were there. And this is when they would have also briefly met, I believe, Michael Snow, who was the figure of American avant-garde who most directly impacted Vukica Đilas's own aesthetic. So in her films, you see a very interesting intertwining of the kind of diaristic, quotidian, everyday aesthetic tendency, which is associable but different from Mekas's own. And that is also laced with very strong influences of structural film. There are actually sections of her films that are directly riffing off of or are homages to some of the structural film devices that you find in Michael Snow's films.
There is also, sorry for interrupting you, there is one scene where she actually shoots a projection on TV, after midnight projection of Snow's films on Yugoslav television.
Yes, and I keep saying, I think the history of the importance of television as a source of archival imagery and found footage for Yugoslav experimental filmmakers, this history yet has to be written. And it's a fascinating topic because it pops up in so much work, in so many different experimentals of our region. But back to that broader story, Vukica Đilas is maybe not a missing link. I mean, missing link between the two avant-garde, Sasha, as you pointed out, maybe missing link in the sense that her films, until they were recently made available, or somewhat available, were virtually unknown to the public. People knew that she walked around with her little camera a lot and took, shots, but these were never screened. And in fact, Branko Vučićević was the cameraman probably for much of this, certainly when she is on screen, Vukica Đilas. In any case, her connection between the two avant-gardes or the two avant-garde tendencies in Yugoslav context is very important, I think, because on the one hand, she is a kind of underground filmmaker par excellence. And on the other hand, she is also somebody who had appeared in Lazar Stojanovic's Plastic Jesus as an actress. And Plastic Jesus itself, I think, its political content aside, just stylistically, aesthetically, cinematically, is a film that is itself one of the strongest symptoms of the intertwinement of the two avant-garde. It's heavily influenced by the French Nouvelle Vague in terms of its tableau staging, jump cutting, etc., approach to narrative and so on, but it's also very directly and explicitly influenced by the twofold tendency, on the one hand, Andy Warhol and a kind of deadpan shot, And on the other hand, Bruce Conner and his editing style, which is more than anything probably a defining trait of editing that Lazar undertook in that film. Not to mention, of course, with Vukica Đilas, there's, of course, Tom Gotovac, and this has been talked about a great deal. I mean, the epigon of experimental filmmaking as the protagonist in Lazar's film, and so on and so forth. But if I can just conclude this by stepping a step back further still, within the domain of two avant-gardes. I saw that a question was also posed, I think, by Milena Dragicevic-Šešić about whether some other figures, in addition to Makavejev, people like Vlada Petrić and Dušan Stojanović and others should also be credited.
I would like just to add Vladimir Pogačić explicitly, especially because of this anecdote that Šijan talked about uncomprehension in Yugoslav Cinematheque in Belgrade. Why I remember as a student at the beginning of 70s that Pogačić was very much aware of Maćunas, of Mekas, and he taught us quite well.
Pogačić too, indeed. But my point was, where I was going was that, I mean, Vlada Petrić, of course, by the fact that he was himself a key figure in literally in maintaining, if you will, the transatlantic connection, as a figure who was at Harvard for a number of years, who studied at NYU. Actually, his dissertation, doctoral dissertation about Soviet cinema and Dziga Vertov, was the very first PhD defended at an American university, a PhD in film studies, and it was under the supervision of the aforementioned Annette Michaelson. So yes, of course, he played an important role also in this kind of ongoing cross-cultural dissemination. But Dušan Stojanović, I think, is especially also interesting and sometimes indeed not acknowledged enough. When you look at Geff, the book of Geff, the early conversations, this is not to diminish by any means Makavejev's role, which of course is crucial in, as we heard today too, in promoting all waves of experimental tendencies hitting the shores of Yugoslav film culture, if you will. But when you read these conversations, early Geff conversations, you see that actually one of the earliest proponents, one of those who actually recognized the richness of the Geff tendency in particular, the anti-film tendency, which we can bill safely as a kind of proto-structural and proto-structural materialist film tendency before that name had been coined by Sidney and others, which again, I'm sorry, is not to get into who was first there or not. That story is pointless and leads nowhere. But there was a genuine autochthonous tendency in Yugoslavia, in Croatia, in Zagreb in particular, Split too, but Zagreb, Geff, for what at the time, Dušan Stojanović was one of the earliest ones to recognize its value for what it was. Whereas people who, like Makavejev and others, who were very strong proponents of generally experimentation, also had a somewhat different sensibility. They were more in line with the kind of expressionist and surrealist tendency, which is, if you want to stick, Greg, to Sidney's terminology, was the mode of psychodrama, the legacy of Maya Deren and maybe early Stan Brakhage, something that you find also in a lot of interesting films from the first generation of AFC. But it was Dušan Stojanović who gave some of the stronger initial reactions from the perspective of a film theorist of the value of Geff. And of course, different generation, but Hrvoje Turković as well, who wrote extensively about this and did a great work in establishing its significance.
So Hrvoje is joining us. Hello, Hrvoje.
Hello.
Very good to see you. Hi.
Let me give some facts, because I was first-hand witness to certain points of mentioned points. Now, to correct Greg, I wasn't present in Pula when Sydney showed the program of Brekić films. But I was present in Zagreb, the presentation of the whole program. Basically, the program started very late in the night and lasted throughout the night to the morning. And I was there, and besides seeing all those films, all those authors that were mentioned already, I was most impressed by the Fluxus films, because part of the program was anthology, Fluxus anthology, and it was impressive to see some film like Yoko Ono's Backs and Smile. I already forgot that were very impressive films, Then what perhaps is not known, that when I was back from America, from my postgraduate studies at the NYU, listening to Adam Paul Sidney lectures and Annette Michaelson's lectures. I was their pupil at the time. I was head in Zagreb. When I was back in Zagreb, I was head of the newly established multimedia center. And one of my organization was a cycle of American underground film. Basically, I would prefer to speak about American avant-garde or American experimental film, but I titled the series, the cycle, as American Underground, because the term underground, and especially American underground, was very attractive at the time. It has a high attraction, and it proves very fruitful because the projections were crowded. People were standing. It was shown in a gallery, art gallery, which was adapted in the evening to be film projecting space. And people were so crowded that people would stand outside the gallery trying to see over the heads the projection. Basically, I compiled the program of American experimental or avant-garde films through American consulates, through the culture attaché, who gave me the list of films that were all over the film library, American libraries all over the Europe. So I got the list of films that were possessed by different libraries in Europe, and then from this list I picked up the American known names of American avant-garde and compiled the program, which was, I think, it had about 4 or 5 installations. I'm not sure anymore. And for example, Brier's film, Emscher's films, Brekić films were shown, and a lot of other names, were shown. And it was a very successful showing. I'm not sure how much it influenced anybody, but most of the public was young people, and it was highly attractive. So that's and one curious point when Levi mentioned the publication of Macaré's script on their Mysteries of Organism somewhere in 77 or something like that. I published. I was editor in a film section in Theatrical Magazine Prologue, and at the time, their Mysteries of Organism was practically banished in Yugoslavia, not shown in cinemas. And we published the excerpts translated from English of Vier. It was kind of in spite of the banishment of the air, and I wrote an essay on Machiavelli. So these are a few historical points which could be interesting for Greg, to you.
Super, thank you very for this intervention, and thank you, Branko.
Anna or Branko, I don't know if you see Milena's comments also in the chat. It's visible to panelists only.
I could read her. But
okay, Anna.
Let me just say that I will turn off the camera. I'm sorry for I'm doing that to you, but my connection is really bad. Even I'm in New York, but connection is horrible. So I will stop video, okay? Okay. So Milena's comments are about the good ending of the story could be the guest visit of Ivan Velisavljević with alternative film archive of the Academic Cine Club and House of Culture Student City in MoMA, New York. Then, more from Milena. Ivko Šešić, wow, had written about collection of American embassy in his written statements that he sent, and role of Marija Majdak in KCB, the Kulturni Centar Beograd. Nada and Kosta Carina have been the most active translators of film, subtitling, and performances at BITE, for example. And then there is another note from Professor Sundholm. I have my glasses on. Hi, Greg, thanks for this. Yes, Sydney were in Venice in 1967. Okay, so let me say I really love the last 15 minutes of this, and instead of kind of repeating the curatorial intentions with all of this, which we will have ample time to discuss both through this session, through those sessions, and in the second part and in the catalog, I would like to kind of prize what Greg did today and Pavle's comments and your discussions, and by a means of acknowledgement and praise, say something about why I think this is a good way to return to things which have no doubtedly done before in many ways. So first I want to say to Greg that I think it's incredibly important that you mentioned the Karolish Niemann notes. They are published, so that's how I know of them, in Imaging Her Erotics. It's a collection. And if those are the notes of her first viewing of Makaveyev's Reich film, right? They're kind of very intimate. They have something of what Pavle was suggesting throughout, this kind of idea of recognition more than idea of influence. There is definitely, but in this case, of complete intimate recognition, which I think it's kind of, it's erotic, as everything Karolish Niemann wrote, and it's a very specific text. And I start with this notion of the text because I think I have a slightly different view personally, both in my research and in artwork, and from what is going on in some levels of this debate. I don't think this is a proper history, what you're doing here. And it's good for it, right? Nor it's completely the kind of curatorial artistic research which will allow itself to kind of think conceptually where it doesn't have evidence. You keep calling your evidence anecdotal evidence, which I have kind of a problem with. But I do recognize one very special moment, performative moment, which happened today. When you start imagining what would Mak, as a kind of means of seduction, say to Sydney to come to Yugoslavia, you start kind of imagining the dialogue which might have happened. And I thought, wow, look at Greg. He spent, like all empirical researchers, me including, and some historians, but people who spend so much time with a certain, not only documents and the archives, but with personalities, right? You kind of start knowing in one way, one part of this discussion is what was going on here for the last 20 minutes when we think we know who that person is and would that person kind of sit in the room and watch alternative film or not. Those are kind of fantastic guesses, but as Pavle, I think, rightly say, those are guesses, right? But the second part is this mimetic moment, which happens when you research something which sees itself maybe as a canon, but was thinking about itself through most of its history as an alternative to the mainstream canon. So in all those kind of networks which think of themselves almost as a certain kind of undercover work, the historization evidence is overly storytelling. And I think there is something here which is beyond the usual common discussion about how we cannot trust memory and so on, but it's important. This is a field, almost magnetic field of storytelling. Like if you read any of them, or if many of us had pleasure spending time with Makavejev or and some other people, Vukica, some other people mentioned here, those people are highly referential. Reference becomes something incredibly important for this research, right? Those references and recognition of those references are almost as important as the years, right, in which something happened, right? So, for example, like late 90s Vukica's writing will have, there is a story, I'm paraphrasing, where I think Rasha Todosievich is telling her about some work she wrote. It's like, well, nobody will recognize this. Nobody except us, meaning except us who were within, would understand what you're writing about, right? There is this kind of, especially in the 60s, but in certain kind of countercultures or alternative movements, there is this kind of sense that nobody outside will kind of get in. And what you're kind of doing here, and I think it's absolutely exciting, not only as a story, and then I understand the need to kind of correct that where it's possible or have a debate about it. But I think the system, the almost kind of a star system of references, which in certain ways matches between what we understand as a canon of, and I don't come from film, but I spent my life with people who come from film and studied them from a different point of view. I think that's the system of references is what is so incredibly interesting, and they kind of contribute to those moments of recognition or affinity or just simple friendship here through the friendship. And that's why we have this whole newly developing idea about Vukica and some other people. Now, the question is how people who fully belong to that system of references, who are within, like she, for example, or Carolee actually have some essays of her troubles with feminist critics and so on, and her friends in the movement. Yeah, there's a very complex question. Now, people who are completely within, like Bojana Makavejev or Bojana Marian or Vukica, who are completely within, are also and respected from their lovers, friends, brothers, sisters. Also, in certain way, didn't went through the certain kind of recognition, or their work was neglected. Although their work was also in certain way withdrawn, right? We are talking about artists who were withdrawing their work. They were kind of hiding their work in many ways. What is happening here, but there were stories about the work. So the first time I heard about Vukica's not only film, but writing, because I heard stories about them. And I never saw the work. I saw the work and I found the work like 15 years later, but I knew they exist. I know there were collages, and there actually two collages everybody's talking about, nobody actually saw in the last 10, 15 years, right? So this kind of storytelling, which is happening in this research, I know you're interested in this kind of more proper historian side, is incredibly important, because that's the way you could actually think about those connections, because there are influences and exchanges between the people who found themselves intrigued or found themselves almost kind of recognized or mirrored in something which they discovered on the other side, right? So in a certain way, I think this kind of reference and way to kind of understand the worlds and the films they like and the films they don't like and the authors which they like. For example, it's very important to understand that, of course, the best English was Vukica's English. She's a translator, right? The best English-speaking person among all of them is actually her. Branko is fine, but she actually is a translator. So in many ways, I think to understand those networks, if we want to call them that way, I think it's also to kind of in a certain way almost map, and I like that Branko called this mapping. It is map, but not map for the outsider, but map the system of references which in a certain way play between them and almost intentionally sometimes erase or delete their traces, right? Many of the people we mentioned mystified or intentionally fetishized certain events and didn't leave the evidence of them and left evidence of something else. So we should not be kind of that worried that some of this evidence you call anecdotal evidence is missing. I think what is exciting. I just find this really remarkable that you're worried about some days, but then you will go and invent the whole dialogue between those two people because you have right to do so. And it's a kind of certain mimetic process, which I think it's very exciting and it's worthy of the circle of people you're researching. So those are my comments. And just to comment on somebody who asked, well, we don't have a boundaries in this project. That's the whole thing. Otherwise, we will be doing research on some kind of different topics than the people who would with whom we could have a certain kind of dialogues, and certain kind of dialogues will not be possible. And when it comes to the question of gender, we will need to understand both that in the context and how it looks today to our students. And it's kind of Caroline Schneemann is actually a fantastic example of that. I was not teaching her in my course, but I was assisting in the course she was taught. And God, she was seen as a kind of a second wave feminist nobody wanted to agree with. So there is this kind of, we need to understand kind of broader picture where to place those people and where the influences on each other and on the second generations and the third and us present here are so interesting. We need to kind of, for a moment, for a time being, forget to kind of be right about this. It's kind of less important than be right by them, and that's how I understand this. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for elaborating this. It was, someone was saying something.
I would like maybe to just add a final comment, which dovetails with what Anna was saying. In I think a related way, and that is, I mean, different kinds of histories exist indeed, and they have their own value. I just think it's important to point out when we're talking about these kinds of cross-cultural relations by way of arts, by way of experimental arts, and by way of experimental cinema in this case in particular, it's worth keeping in mind also that the history of reception of avant-garde cinema, how this used to take place was a very different modality from how it is today. When we're talking about the pre-video era, not to mention pre-digital era, a most common mode was in fact one's burgeoning interest in experimental cinema from somewhere about which one would have learned last of all through the films themselves. Because to get to the films often meant long-standing commitment to learning everything there is about that film culture, reading the journals, periodicals, books, etc., constructing in your own mental cinema what these films are. And very often for years and years not being able to have any access to them until you finally also at some point insert the films themselves into the kind of mental, discursive, imagistic, etc. mosaic that you have been creating. That modality is not any longer, I don't want to say not any longer with us, but it's certainly not the dominant mode anymore. And it's worth keeping in mind as a point of reference also for a discussion such as this. Other than that, I also would like to thank the organizers again and everybody for a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pavle. And I think that with that point, we should, make a stop. And it's a very good point to end our discussion. I think this discussion was really interesting, and I really loved it, enjoyed it very much. This discussion will be soon online on the Center for Cultural Decontamination website, along with other information, also working material we want to put also on the site. We'll have a special website of this particular project where we'll not only put the recordings of these discussions, but what we call the different working materials that researchers have collected and want to share with us. So please stay with us. And as I mentioned, this is just the first in a series of discussions that we plan for May and June. And I would like to really thank particularly Greg and Pavle for this amazing insights and for sharing with us all their knowledge and research they've done in this field. So thank you a lot, and thanks to everyone who joined in and asking all the fantastic questions and comments that shape this discussion even better.